After all those years of looking at my diary, my little 1965 diary, my mom had got me to try to help me journalize and write more and read more. Actually, my IQ is 122, so I wasn't having a problem, but I'm a little bit autistic, it turns out. I didn't find out I was on the spectrum until I was 22 years of age. Anyway, going back to the June 5th, 1967, I was 12 years and some months, and Debbie was 12 years and some months. I was born in September of 54. Debbie is born in November of 54. I've told you about the ride at Jeb Stuart. I'm very, very curious as why Bundy would go to Jeb Stuart. You know, when somewhere in his readings he said he lived for a short time in a neighborhood where there was a lot of Italians and they seemed foreign to him and a different religion. I guess he didn't want to be biased, but actually Protestants were kind of biased against Catholics. Some of them still are. You know, they didn't like the idea of a pope and all this and blah, blah, blah. And I imagine his mother being a Methodist she might have been like the other Protestants and kind of had don't get involved with a Catholic girl. Could he have had a crush on a little slightly older Catholic girl, like our music teacher down at Jeb Stuart? Her name was like Rosalind, Joyce Rosalind, or Rossellini or something. It wasn't Rossellini, like the governor candidate. No, it was similar, though. It was very similar, actually. Could he have had a crush back in Seattle or Tacoma, wherever they lived? I saw he lived in about 3 different places. I didn't realize that, including his uncle's house, which made it like 4 places in Seattle before. I'm talking about his parents' homes. There was one place on Skyline or something where he lived for like from 7 to 15 or 7 to 20 or something. So that was the main one that he lived in. But he does mention that there was a time when he was in an Italian neighborhood, which, by the way, Mr. Dellenberger, I'm beginning to think traveling had something to do with it, his murders. Because what I'm thinking is he repressed the fact that he was ripped out at 4 years old from what he thought was his home in Philadelphia and then taken to Washington State. There had to have been a great psychological rift when you're taken from your parents' home with an older sibling, kind of a resentment that would have built up, and he didn't express it like a normal person, but repressed it inside himself. And then forevermore, when he traveled, he had some kind of resentment because it was ripping him from something. Anyway, that's a whole different thing. So I'm looking at my diary, and my dad usually would take 2 weeks off to go on vacations, whether we were traveling to Philadelphia and going through Washington, and poor man had to drive like 12 hours to go see Grandma Stelzer, and where did they live? They lived in Johnstown. They lived right off the Navy base. And my mom grew up there. She worked for the War Department. She was a riveter and all of that. And then my dad's people were from Ecru, Mississippi, and I remember driving, and we would stop at places like national parks, and we'd have Czech soda from Winn-Dixie, you know, orange, root beer, whatever, and then we'd have a bologna sandwich my mom had in a styrofoam cooler. You know, you might have some chips and or potato salad or something she brought, and a sandwich, and we'd have it at a national park. And then when we finally got to Ecru, it was like a hollows. There were like kudzu on each side and red cliffs, red clay cliffs with the covered in kudzu, and go down and down and down. And finally, my dad knew where there was like a dreamette, and he would let us stop and get a 25-cent ice cream cone when we finally got. Now, I mean, we would drive from like 4 a.m. until it seemed like all day long. And then finally we were in, you know, so he had his parents in Ecru, and then Bobby, his aunt. We had Faulkner, Mississippi, and Memphis, Tennessee. So there's 3 places we go to. We went to Shiloh National Park once. So I was going on this vacation. We were going to go to Daytona. And my dad always would take 2 weeks. But this summer, for some reason, he was only going to take the 1 week. And then later, some of his people were coming down. And this was 1967. And, of course, the war in Vietnam was escalating. And he had to work on those Bell and Howell helicopters at NAS. That was, you know, and then when my brother went to Vietnam, it was like a mission that he keep them helicopters going because Johnny was in the 80s, was it 82nd Airborne? 1st Air Cavalry. My mom wanted him. I can't remember. She didn't want him. I don't know. But he was. I mean, my mom would cry at the dinner table the whole time Johnny was in Vietnam. It was very disturbing. We didn't want him to come home in a box, And the whole 18-month, it kind of disrupted my high school, by the way. Anyway, all that going on every night. It was very dramatic, and they'd have the body counts on the news and everything. So I hope this is able to upload. But anyway, so that summer, here we are. We're up at Jeb Stewart. I was reluctant to be taking summer band. The teacher was about 23, 24, and she was over the music department at Jeb Stewart. And her saying, you can look it up. And I was wondering about that too, is locate, because I wondered why in the hell, see, Mr. Sullivan, why would he bypass so many schools? There's Pine Grove, there's Hyde Grove, there's Lake Shore Elementary, there's some Catholic schools, there's several, A. Philip, I can't remember what they're called, Lackawanna. There were several schools he went by from I-10 and I-95 to get to Jeb Stewart. It was several miles off the interstate. So I'm thinking, years ago, I went up there and looked in the yearbooks trying to figure out if he was looking for his father. That, his stepfather had like 10 siblings. Who was he looking for at Jeb Stewart to show up there in 1967 and then again on his rampage in 1978? They're 10 years and 8 months difference. Like right now, Leslie Parmenter is like 10 years younger than me, so I'm 72, so she's probably about 61, okay? Anyway, I'm wearing this red, I was wearing those beachcombers. They were polyester beachcombers, and Debbie was dressed up for summer, now that I think about it. She was dressed up, and, in my household, we had your winter wear for school, all your school. When school had just got out, it was like June 5th, 1967, and I imagine I was wearing one of my brother's oversized Gant shirts because he was like 15 or 16. He had a red motorcycle, a red Honda Eagle or something, bright red. He was a chunky boy at that time. He got himself in shape, but he had a tendency to overeat. He had a eating disorder anyway with Johnny. There was a lot of neuroticism in my family. But anyway, Debbie's family was worse. Her mother was bipolar, manic depression is what they called it back then. And at one point at a dinner table, Miss Davis and my mom were talking and said that Jean had electroshock therapy. And the woman had a wonderful heart. She's raising the 3 girls, Debbie, Vicky, and Jeannie. Jean, Jeannie, Vicky, and Debbie. And I can't help but think, when Debbie gave Bundy her phone number, 2 of them were opposed and scared and upset about the ride. And then the other one may have secretly bought a ruse where he said, well, I was just showing those kids that they shouldn't be hitchhiking. Mr. Sullivan, my hitchhiking attempt had nothing to do with the ride. I believe during band session, I was learning about assembling my clarinet, and Miss Rosalind was showing, I think her name was Rosalind, anyway. She was showing me how to assemble the clarinet because there's several pieces to it. And my mom had got that at a pawn shop, and it was just like, I'm going to keep it while summer band is on, then we'll take it back after summer band. They may have been saving for something. They got very penny pinching when they were saving for something. And I think around that year, they may have remodeled the den, which was a porch, to be enclosed and then have a half bath built out there. Anyway, so they were saving for something, whether it was a new car or whatever. But anyway, like I said, we'd have Czech soda and bologna sandwiches on our way to Memphis or whatever. We were going to Daytona. And then after band, Debbie just abruptly stops at the bleachers outside of the school. And I'm thinking, I want to go home. Maybe we were getting, and I can tell from the diary, that it took me 6 years to read forward and backward in that diary and realize we were going to Daytona. I didn't want to hang around that school. I wanted to go home and get ready for Daytona. And it also explains why I looked like Rasputin wearing my brother's Gant shirt and some raggy old things, whereas Debbie was wearing a brand new peasant top, Hirachi-type sandals, and cut off Hager jeans that she had frayed. She was like, I'm ready for summer. And like me, I barely had any summer outfits, I had my winter outfits. I didn't have my summer outfits. And we were transitioning from 7th grade into 8th grade. So anyway, I think she said she had a blister on her foot or something. This is what I have to extrapolate that because I do not know. But I think during band, he may have approached her and said, I'm going to be a coach here. Because, I mean, he wasn't wearing a shirt. He was just wearing khaki shorts. How do you explain that? He had a brand new Volkswagen. When I was standing out there on the curb, he went right by me. He didn't stop by me. He went right to where Debbie was gesturing her hands on the bleachers. That much I remember. So I went walking across. I said, hey, naked, because he wasn't wearing a shirt. And I went across the street. This red Volkswagen is standing there by the bleachers. Debbie got down and started talking. I couldn't hear what they were talking about. I do remember at some point maybe trying to locate a piece of paper so she could write her phone number down, because all we had was I had my clarinet case and maybe a little diary, which Steve Parmenter had written in, by the way. Yes, Steve Parmenter was in several of my classes at Cedar Hills and different schools. Jeb Stewart, maybe, I don't remember. Jeb Stewart, Cedar Hills, Stonewall Jackson, perhaps. Cedar Hills Church, did they go there? I don't know. I know Mr. Parmenter was at the sheriff's office where I was there for 2.5 years in my 20s. I remember, Mr. Parmenter, he had strawberry blonde hair. He was just a patrol officer. And I remember Mr. Mickler. He was a Lieutenant Mickler, and James Parmenter, was it? I don't remember, but he would be at the information desk sometimes. We were between the information desk and the property room was across the hall. That was a whole debacle, by the way, too. Anyway, Debbie said, get in the car. And I said, no. I said, it's just pretend. I get in a car with this guy who's 22 years old. What the hell? I said, no, it's just pretend. And she looked at me, and then the seat had this little latch thing that you would move forward. It would look like a guitar pick. It was white, but the seats were black Naugahyde. And she pushed it forward, and then, of course, I got in. After a few moments, I said, well, okay, he's going to give us a ride. I don't know who he is. He was like a grown man, GQ. He had a good haircut. He was a nice-looking guy. He had a mole somewhere on his neck or something. And I said, there's books back here. And he said, just move the books. Just move the books. And anyway, he backed out from in that little orange clay spot, and he got on the baseball road, and he went towards Lamoille. And then I'm looking at my clarinet and thinking, well, this isn't bad. We'll get home faster. And he turned onto Lamoille, went to Wesconet, and that time the Howard Hardware, Towers Hardware had a cow pasture there. It wasn't Amazon. It wasn't Kmart even. It was a cow field with some pecan trees lining it. Anyway, because I remember talking about Robert F. Kennedy the next year, the next June or something, Robert Kennedy, and I said, we shall overcome. I said, we can do something about that someday, because, that was the second Kennedy that had been assassinated, but that was the next year, in the final year at Jeb Stewart. But anyway, so he pulls a revolver, and it was like a silver revolver, not like nickel. It was more like silver, a fancy revolver. And he transformed into this monster-looking guy. And I looked in the rearview mirror, and his eyes were hollow, just hollow, evil eyes. And there was a stink. There was a stink that came up that smelled like, you ever see a pile of dirty clothes like at the Capel's house? It was like, because there were, like, you have fresh clothes and dirty clothes, or you ever had got close to a hobo and they smelled like fecal, urine, and sweat. It was like that combination. I said, oh, damn. And I said, what is your name? And he said, Theodore. And I said, Theodore? What is your last name? And he said, Bundy. And I said, your name is Bundy, like my clarinet, and your gun is silver like Debbie's flute. I said, Debbie's father's an admiral at NASA. And then you ought to meet Vicky and Jeannie. They're so pretty and already out on their own. If you're looking for girls, why don't you go up to the high school? Because, what the hell was he doing at a junior high school? And then Debbie was stone-faced and quiet. She was not talking. And then as she realized when I was talking, I think he had to put the gun down because everybody was leaving the school. Apparently the requirement was the classes, the body shop, the card playing, the basketball, everything shut down around noon, and we were all exiting the school. And then after the students exit, the teachers and staff would exit. So apparently between 12 and 1, it was closing down. So that meant a line of traffic. So he put the gun down as he turned onto West Gannett. As we drove down West Gannett, I guess his whatever he was doing transformed. He would have killed Debbie. So she needs to stop and realize he would have killed her. If she had gotten in the car, if I had said, no, I'm not getting in, which I could have easily done, then she would have been gone. And I guess that would have been a scar on my life. But because we were together and it fouled up his plan. And I wonder where the hell did he get a red Volkswagen? It says on a lot of things that he was using his girlfriend's money. But why, and Mr. Dellenberger, I wonder why would he cross the entire nation? That's what he did when he was a little boy. When he was a baby, his mom took him from Philadelphia to Tacoma. So why would he do that if he was involved in a relationship? Was there something gnawing him that he said, I've got to find out what this problem is before I go forward? And he had time because he wasn't due in Stanford until the 24th or 25th, according to Dillenberger's book. So basically he was free. And another thing, he withdrew from his classes, which I believe were at Puget Sound, and the classes weren't over till April. So what in the hell was that about? Just having a relationship with making his classes mess up? I guess so. Anyway, this is 16 minutes, and you know dang well my phone does not want to upload squat. It's something new with YouTube and me and the way I haven't done one in a while, so it won't upload, but I'm hoping it will upload. But what I was going to go on to is I found out from my diary, now when I read the page that was ripped out, I can still read bright red, talking to, and possibly Theodore Bundy, because I see a T and an H and then many letters going across the page and then a B and a Y. But that's all I can make out. And it is harder than hell to make it out. Because remember, when I came back from Daytona, I told Debbie I wrote about the incident. She says, no, you can't write in your diary about it. Your mom will read your diary and we'll get in big trouble. We hitchhiked and he had a gun. Well, you know what? Miss Vida person that does she works at a bio, her husband was a biochemist or something, a biotechnician, and he created the smallest EKG on record. And he also created a system that was, when they tell a person with a pacemaker not to go by a microwave, there's some kind of electromagnetic thing that goes on between a pacemaker, aircraft, television, and he created a blocking system for it. And she's still working that industry at 72, and she's probably a multimillionaire, whereas I'm just barely a multimillionaire, just barely. Okay, so, anyway, and this is what I'm against. I have to go up and, oh, no, we're not. What I think happened is Vicki and Debbie were adamantly opposed to have anything to do with him. But there was one phone in the household. And if the older sister, Jeannie, picked it up, and okay, I'm going to say something. Do you ever hear of traumatic narcissism? She has a fit if you even mention that ride. Debbie admits the ride. She says, we don't talk about that. We don't dwell on that. What the hell? What the hell? I think it's very important. And yes, I think he may have had something to do with Virginia Helms, as far-fetched as that seems. In August, in Liz Clofer's book, she said she used his Chevron thing a couple of times because he wanted to use her car for some reason. Then he wrecked it, but he wanted to use her car when he had to go from Tacoma to Seattle to the wherever Department of Emergency Services. He was wrapping it up before he left. After Lake Sammamish, he left that state. He was going to Utah. He used her car. He wrecked her car. She used his Chevron car to fill his card. That was August. September, he's over in Utah. And his younger brother, Rick, says, I was at an airport. Hell, he was at the airport, and he said he was looking weird and told me to go home. So he's got Carol Boone's divorce money, Liz Cloper's money, and the residual from working all summer at a halfway decent job, and he's over in Utah. What would keep him from flying down to Florida and replicating that 67 ride and then pick that little girl up and kill her because he couldn't find us? Because remember, In 74, 75, Mrs. Sexton, Debbie's mom, had sold that home and moved into an apartment at Confederate Point. She sold the home. So he was all over the west side. That was in 78, though. This would have been 74, and it would have been a trip to try to replicate. And when he left out of Tallahassee, he was in a reddish-orange Volkswagen. And I'm proud of some of the things I found out. Volkswagen, unlike Ford and Chevy and General Motors, Chevy and Ford had like 1,000 models of their key, and Ford had 8,000 models of the key. That meant one person in 1,000 could use a Chevy key, and one person in 8,000 could use a Ford key, and it would be the same key. Volkswagen of Germany had 13 models. Can you imagine? They only had 13 model keys. So if you had 6 or 7 models of those keys, there's a good chance you could open any Volkswagen and take off riding. That was in the 50s through the 70s. They only had 13 model keys. I had to search that down to some guy with a Volkswagen aficionado, and he said yes. He said they only had 13 models of the keys, which might explain them keys that Liz saw in his place. Even my mom had a Volkswagen key in her jewelry box. My half-sister liked Volkswagens, by the way. And Kathleen's father had a Volkswagen because he worked for Eastern Airline. And he had to travel from Jacksonville to Eastern Airline until my dad helped him get a job at NAS. Okay, we're going to leave that now. And hopefully you will probably try to do some kind of research on the Virginia Helms situation, because all he had to do was have Marjorie, that girl he met in Utah, or somebody in Utah, Glenn, whoever was there, to fill his car up 2 days. And then in the meantime, fly down to Jack's, go to Hilltop or Hertz or Avis were active then at Imus Airport, and rent him a red Volkswagen and be traveling around Jacksonville trying to locate us, which was hard to do because I was working nights at the pier. No, in 74, I don't know. He never knew where I lived. I don't know. It was late 74. Anyway, I think it could have been him. Thank you. Bye-bye.